Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. In this week's episode, we're exploring the idea of transcending ego in a way that you may not have experienced before.
For this week, I think the interesting subject we're going to be covering is the topic of ego. As you and I both know, no matter what spiritual book that we've picked up over the many years, it's a consistent theme or topic that does seem to appear quite often.
Yes, it does.
And I don't know about you, but I know my relationship with ego has changed a lot as years has went on. It's become less of a priority. It's not something I even talk about with my clients that often compared to maybe when at the start. But I guess I'm intrigued for us to have this conversation and see where it goes, because my feelings definitely towards it have evolved a lot over the years. I think we're going to talk about maybe a simple definition of what ego is so that we're all on the same page of the definition we'll be exploring, because as you and I both know from the little bit of research we did prior to this episode, there's just so many different definitions, and depending if you're coming at it from a spiritual angle, a psychology, therapy angle, self-help, philosophy, the list goes on. So it is quite difficult to find one definition that kind of captures it all. But the one that we have settled on is, at its simplest, the ego can be thought as your sense of I or self. It's the continuous part of you that experiences the world, makes decisions, and thinks thoughts. It's the part of you that says, I am doing this, I think this, or I feel this. That's it in a very quick summary.
Like you said, my definition of ego has really evolved over the years. And so in simplest of terms, I guess you could say that, in all the books that I've read, there's so many different definitions and so many authors kind of treat the ego as the enemy. And so if it's the I am and I feel, then I don't think of it as the enemy.
Well, I think it just becomes a very confusing subject for most people, because it's a very encrypted message, I think, in a lot of these books. A lot of people just take it for what it is, in the sense of the ego is the enemy, as you said, and it's just time to get rid of it, along with the mind and everything else that makes us human, quite frankly. So I think we probably will come at this at some interesting angles, and even to extend on from that definition, it's your personal identity or self-image that differentiates you from others. It helps you navigate and interact with the world around you, giving you a sense of individuality and continuity in your experiences. It's personal experiences and mental conditioning. It's viewed as a constructed sense of self made up of thoughts, memories, experiences, and perceptions. Again, that's it in more detail, but I think the first line that I read out kind of captures it in the sense of I or self, and of course, thoughts, memories, experiences, and perceptions.
So let me just get this clear. So what we're saying, the simple definition that we're agreeing on is we're referring to the ego as that which we identify as I, or our sense of self, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and what differentiates us from everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think in talking about that, what actually would help, we would recommend listening to Your Sacred Contracts, which is in this season 2, and exploring divine purpose / divine design in season 1.
Yes.
And the reason why I think that'd be a good place to start before listening to this episode is because we often bring it back to contracts and our own individual contracts, our experiences, all of the human parts of us. And I think that's where it's interesting, because the more that I explored this understanding with Michael, everything's designed out for you, everything's chosen by you, all of these different things, I'm going to say something that I never thought I would say if you had asked me 10 years ago, is that I really do love my ego.
There you go.
And I want to explain why that is because I think, as you even mentioned, or even as you were explaining about the definition, the I component I don't think is the enemy, especially if I've chosen every part of me, of what I'm currently experiencing. It's my responsibility to actually explore every part of the ego that I have chosen to have as part of my spiritual experience. So therefore, it's not necessarily the ego that is necessarily the problem. It's our lack of awareness or understanding of why the ego needs to exist. And I think the common thread that we often talk about is that when it comes to the mind or the body or the emotions or personal experiences, it's that if I know we're probably sounding like a broken record to some people at this stage, but when it comes to 8 billion of us, plus or minus, that have all of these components, that have these experiences in many different ways, to say that it shouldn't exist, or that that's actually stopping us from getting in contact with our version of our energy, or spiritual enlightenment, or awakening, or those kind of components, it just never made sense to me on a logical level, because if it's so wrong, or if it shouldn't exist, or it should be quiet, and then why does 8 billion of us experience it in different ways? So surely it's more that there's an understanding around it that needs to be explored. And I think it's that I've actually found peace within understanding my ego and everything that comes along with it. Has taken a lot of work and a lot of emotional exploration, mental exploration, and a lot of it, the journey of acceptance. Absolutely. Is it still a bumpy road? Of course. But I think is that what I love about this is that to the day I die, I'll forever study my ego. And then whenever I'm finished on this earth with my last breath, I will leave behind everything that this ego has taught me on this unique spiritual journey.
Well, I think what's interesting about what you're saying, and I think I like the way that you're explaining it, but I think I want to dive in a little bit deeper, because someone asked me about this the other day in regards to sacred contracts. And the question was, do you really believe that you chose this experience? And I was like, well, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it's easy to say, yes, I did, or no, I didn't. But that, in the definition of what you're saying, is my ego or my personality or myself. My personality or my ego in this particular life that I'm experiencing right now did not choose the path.
No.
The part of me that is connected to a higher sense that knows far more than I do chose that path. And so I think what's important then is to go, oh, now here's a better understanding, because if this higher sense of self chose the path, also chose the ego or chose the personality or chose the sense of self, I didn't choose that. That's why I think I've been kicking and screaming for the last few years of my life, because I go, wait a minute, I didn't choose this. But I think it's important to go, oh, okay. The personality gets confused thinking we are the ones who chose it, but it's something more than that.
It's our energy that did, or else even as you said, our higher self, or whatever you want to call it. This is also what we want to make clear, is that any person we've talked, you or I, any person we've talked to about sacred contracts, or the idea of there being a contract, I've yet to meet one person who was willingly open-minded to it straight away. Because we've talked about before, and I'm sure in the previous episodes, is that it's built to kind of trigger us. It's hard for our egos to actually even begin to go to accept that. But this is what I'll make clear, that's normal. And I think it's also going to be a constant for any of us moving forward, but that doesn't change the reality of what we've gone through or what we will go through moving forward.
Right. And so in some of the spiritual books that we have read in the past and that we're talking about, where it is spoken of about how the ego is the problem. So I think there's different aspects of our ego and our personality and ourself and the things that have happened to us that trip us up and get in the way. But I wouldn't say it is the ego. It's having like you said, having the understanding of why we're going through those experiences that then allows the ego to grow and to change. Because we obviously wanted to have this human experience. We obviously wanted to experience the physical realm, for lack of a better way of saying it. And in order to do that, we had to forget, is the way I like to think about it, that energy side of ourself, or that higher self, and come into this human form and this human personality in order to experience whatever it is we're here to grow from. That's how I like to look at it.
But that's exactly it, because ego equals growth. And as long as there's ego present, there's always areas to explore, whether we like it or not. Because from different books that I've read, that even some individuals describe it as the ego is the part of us that wants to keep control of the different areas of our life. Let that be in past, present, future, or certain understanding of certain memories or experiences that we've had. The list goes
Mm-hmm.
on. If you look at everything in that definition of what it defines ego to be, there is so much within that with any one person. But how
Right.
much within that do we actually understand about ourselves? It's questionable because a lot of us haven't never been given the opportunity to actually explore it, or to have a mentor or a teacher or whatever it might be to be able to actually fully utilize the experiences that lie within us. So therefore, when we're still all trying to just get through life, get through day to day, it can be tricky to understand how ego equals growth, because it just feels like we're constantly fighting ourselves, fighting life, trying to make it through the end of the week, the end of the month, the end of the year. So we're not here to transcend the ego. We're here to actually to study it, to understand it, especially if we want back to the understanding that we have chosen it. So therefore, it equals growth. But like anything, it's like there's growing pains naturally going to be attached to it.
Well, naturally, because no one has ever explained this to any of us. Nobody got a little guidebook that says, oh, hey, guess what? You're actually a huge bit of energy that decided to have this human experience. And in the process, you're going to have experiences that are going to happen to you, and you're going to make decisions about those experiences that are going to continue to trip you up, that no one's going to tell you how to look at or explain. And then you're going to decide you want to do a spiritual journey, and someone's going to tell you you need to transcend all of that.
Sold.
Right. And so I go, I mean, that was so frustrating for me. And I think what's frustrating about it is we are conditioned from a very young age to be looking outward instead of to be looking inward. And I know I've said this so many times, but I'm going to repeat it. And so instead of understanding, like when we do decide to look inward, the first thing we get is you need to get rid of your ego. You need to transcend it. You need to, and you're like, well, who am I without it? What do I do? How do I live in the world? How do I earn money if I don't have it? So, and that's never quite really explained by any of those great books that we read.
No, to transcend it, and the way that it's often wrote about, is quite idealistic. It sounds great in theory, but I think coming down to it in a practical day-to-day sense, it's borderline impossible. And that's why, as we've always talked about on this podcast, it does take a lot of exploration and hard work and wanting to understand those different parts of us. Because even in previous conversations that we've had, I think in exploring and understanding what the ego means to you, it can really strip back all the different elements of you, because it kind of, someone asks you, who are you? And then it's like, no, who are you really? And then who are, like, I think everyone's gone through that at some stage. It's been a very frustrating process to go through when someone keeps asking you those questions, but it's still quite revealing to allow you to look at yourself in a very different angle. And when you're doing that, you do begin to see all the different layers of the ego. And that's what I mean by, if you do that journey, you can fall in love with how layered we can be as individuals, is kind of the point. And we're not always going to like what we find, because it's not like that. But I think it's that whether we like what we find or not, that's what we have.
In some instances, we might actually like what we find, because every way that we have gone prior, we have seemed to be a failure, or not able to get it together, or not be able to perform in the way that other people have said. So when we peel away some of those layers, we go, oh, wait, I really am just like everybody else.
But I agree. And I think it's only also by stripping that back that we can actually begin to see where a lot of these patterns, behaviors, components actually come from, where they start, actually begin to feel like we can do something about it, is kind of the point. And when we realize that we can't dissolve, we can't get rid of, and we can't transcend our ego, and we have to find a way in which you have to live with it and work with it, it's kind of the similar messaging that we talked about in You Are Not Your Mind. It's that it'll be a long time on this planet if you keep trying to fight a fundamental part of you that you cannot delete, that you cannot get rid of. So I feel that we have come to a place where we're actually both at peace with the ideas of our ego. That does not mean that it doesn't have its ongoing challenges. But again, if we're not being challenged, we're not necessarily growing as part of the human experience. So you can't have one without the other. So you can still be at peace and still experience growing pains with ego.
Right. Absolutely. Because we're going to have it till the day we die. Correct?
Correct. Because it is that personality. It is those memories, thoughts, experiences, emotions, perceptions. Like, the list goes on.
Hi there. We hope you're enjoying this week's episode. We've been so delighted to see such a fantastic response to the show. And we're excited to now offer you a way to get even more from the podcast. We've been building our Patreon community and are now offering a range of benefits, including weekly bonus episodes, articles, early access to our regular episodes, and weekly check-in polls. And here's something special. We are hosting monthly live question and answer sessions, a fantastic chance to interact directly with us and get your questions answered. We've designed different tiers on Patreon, ensuring there's something for everyone. Find your fit and join us by clicking the link in the episode description or visiting www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. We're excited to welcome you to our Patreon community. Let's continue our journey in practical spirituality together.
So I think if we're ever using the term like transcending, I think it's transcending maybe an old understanding or an old perspective of why the ego needs to exist. You're not actually transcending the ego itself in a human experience. And I think that's a huge thing to talk out, because I feel that is sometimes misread when reading these books, or misinterpreted, because I know I definitely did back then, 15 years ago when I read it.
I would definitely say I did. Yeah.
I took it a little bit too literal.
I did take it literally, very literally. I personally did.
Now looking at ego in the sense of, my journey or my job per se is to explore all of these fundamentals of ego to get a better understanding of myself, to why I would have chose this as part of my spiritual experience. And then if I do that, then there's more likelihood of me finding peace in mind, body, emotions. Oh, that sounds more practical. I can work with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And for so many people, we never hear anything like that, and not anything like that. And so I know, like, even when I first started working with you, you asked me a question at one point, and I can't remember what the question was, but you asked me something, and I said, the goal is to be the best person I can be. And you just kind of fell. I saw the look, you just kind of dropped. And I was like, what's wrong with that answer? And you looked at me and you said, because you already are the best person, but it just tells me that you still believe that there's something wrong with who you are, which is what we're really saying, because as long as we're believing that there's something wrong with who we are as a person, as we're on this journey, then we are not exploring the ego, or we haven't come to that place where we're at peace with, the personality, the emotions, the feelings, the self, as we have been living up to this point. We're still believing that there is actually something wrong with us and with our journey, instead of being able to go, let me understand why I'm having those feelings, or why I think that way about myself.
And as we would have talked about before, it also comes back down to, as you're mentioning there, the level of expectations of ourselves, or comparing ourselves to other, or where we think we should be versus where we are. And even those expectations are all quite often very unrealistic. But this is also what I also love about the ego, or all of those parts of us that make up the ego, is because it does continuously challenge us when we don't understand those different parts, which guarantees growth.
Yes.
And I think that because, as we mentioned, if you're looking at ego being thoughts, memories, emotions, experiences, and perceptions, that is a unique formula for every person, even though there's 8 billion people, give or take. And I think that's why I love it, because without that, we wouldn't be having these unique individual spiritual experiences or journeys. So therefore, what would be the point? So the ego is a huge part. It's what makes us human on a spiritual journey. It's about becoming more aware of those fundamentals of what is within ego, and then building an understanding of what does that actually mean for us moving forward. And that's what I meant earlier by I've actually come to actually love and appreciate my ego and its individual quirkiness in my journey on this planet. And the more I embrace that and its quirkiness and learn to accept that by doing the journey, the more I'm more and more at peace with it. As we talked about in previous episodes, do you and I still have our human moments and catch colds and have all sorts of triggerments? Yes, but I think that's the difference between having the knowledge and wisdom of being able to accept that versus having the expectation that it shouldn't be this way.
Well, exactly. And, the journey that I've had throughout my life has been one where, the focus was on how I wasn't okay. And that was a big part of my journey for, I would say, more than half of my life. I still catch myself. The other day I was trying to do something, and the comment that comes out of my mouth is, I don't think anybody understands how hard it is to be me. Because things that seem to come naturally to other people don't always come naturally to me. The difference today to even 10 years ago is there's a level of acceptance in the fact that I operate differently in the world than most people, and that that's okay, and that it's still me judging me when that's coming up, because it's like I have this expectation that I've done this so many times, I should be able to do it smoothly. And it always continues to surprise me when I have my ADHD moments and things don't go the way they're planned. And I go, I just don't understand. So dare I say this? I think a big part of my journey in understanding my ego is coming back to learning how to accept the quirkiness of this ego that I have, this personality that I have, and the experiences that I've been meant to experience on this journey. And that, if I could have heard that 20 years ago, I think it would have sent me off in a different direction. Because for so long, all I saw was, I'm not that yet. I'm not that yet. I haven't achieved that. I haven't achieved that. I need to achieve that, or else I'm not spiritual, or else I'm not okay, or else I'm not any one of those given things. Instead of starting to understand, wait, I remember the first teacher who ever said to me, because I said, I'm getting there. And she just looked at me and said, where? And I said, I'm getting there to that understanding. She goes, what understanding? And of course I couldn't explain it. And I got frustrated because I'm like, wherever I'm supposed to be.
But I think what's interesting as well is that, well, for many of us, we come from religious backgrounds, religious households, or some sort of religion to some degree. And when you're brought up in a religious state of mind, you're often taught not to ask questions. You're just told this is the way it is. So I think even that did actually translate of when I moved away from religion and actually started to explore New Age spiritual stuff, or spirituality in general, that I actually forgot to ask questions. So therefore anything I read is like, my training was like, this is it. This is gospel. Or this is the way it must be. So it's only when I actually, as years went on, that I started reading more books and starting to explore other things. And this is before, obviously, Michael came through, that it was like, you have to transcend your ego. It's only then when I asked myself, says who?
Right?
Like, this one person sold X million books and now this is just it, And I think that was a huge, even like, to be allowing myself to question, or allowing my ego to actually step up and actually take some responsibility, or be like, okay, that might have worked for this person, but what about me and my individual spiritual journey out of one of 8 billion people? And I think it is about embracing that individuality, not only, as you mentioned, within ourselves, but within all of our experiences, within our mind, within our emotions. It's such a unique and, I won't say beautiful, formula that we all hold, but we've never been able or allowed to embrace it at all throughout our lives. And with it, of course, comes terms and conditioning, comes fighting it at times, loving it, trying to accept it. Sometimes we have to accept that we're not allowed to accept it at times. That is a level of acceptance within itself. So it is a journey, but it's such a fulfilling one when we stop conditioning it according to what someone else said it should be versus how it actually is.
Right. And so the differences, and I know this will come up because early days for me, if you mentioned the word ego, I thought you were talking about someone's vanity.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that is, the very most common way people talk about ego, whether they're on the journey, spiritual journey or not. They go, oh, he's got an ego. So how do we know then, if we're not asking someone or we're not looking for someone else to give us the answer, how do we know when we've gone beyond, it's that vanity or trying to get it right for somebody else, and start to really understand the things that we're meant to get curious about, like our emotions, like how our mind tends to think. Like, I used to think for so long that there was something wrong with my brain because it did not work the way that the majority of people in my life's brain worked.
Yep.
And it wasn't until I was in my mid-40s that I started to realize I have a very unique brain, and it's pretty cool the way it does think. And I'm actually very intelligent. I'm just not very academic. And once I worked that out, it was amazing for me. But there was no one that showed me that, and no one that helped me get that. I just remember building that silly desk going, so there, I can do anything. I can do anything I set my mind to. And so there was no one, there's no guide, I guess is what it is, other than the many spiritual books that are out there, which, just like we're saying, Gareth, you know, that's one person's point of view. That's their journey. That's their opinion. And it's
that's
great.
Right for them.
It's right for them. Just like what we're talking about is right for us. It doesn't mean that it is right. It just is another outlook on what we're talking about. Yeah. So I think it's important to state that. But my original question was, how do we start to get curious and know how to look at these parts of our ego?
But I think that's what you mentioned, is that it is looking at the mind, body, emotions, which equals looking at the thoughts, memories, experiences, and perceptions that we have. So it is actually about beginning to strip back those layers. And I think it's amazing when we often talk about ego, especially say in the vanity side of it or someone else's, we tend to be referencing other people's ego out of judgment. When that person has a huge ego, but we don't necessarily use that, say, awareness or that analysis to actually be able to study or question our own at times. So I think it depends on what way you want to look at it, because as you said before, the external world is just a reflection in its own way of what it's trying to ask us to study or look at or to question. The list goes on. So I think it's stripping it back to the basics of just saying, oh, that's ego. And that's ego, or that's their ego, and that's my ego. And you have to go deeper than just stating what's ego, because everything's ego if you look at the definition of it. The deeper questions is in, why is that a part of my experience, or why is that part of my ego, or where does that stem, or what experience or memories is triggering that to appear in me and my ego in present day? Those become interesting questions. And if you can't answer those components within yourself, because you'll never be able to answer it within other people, that's their journey. So therefore you have to bring it back to yourself and try to find the root of why you spiritually chose to experience it in this way, and how it's appearing in your ego this way in present day. And once you understand that and come to peace with that, then you actually have a better relationship with ego, full stop, within yourself and within others.
And I think the other example I want to give is, you know, when we look at, if we take my life as an example, you know, chaos from the very get-go. And there was a lot of chaos going on, and there was a lot of self-doubt, and there was a lot of anxiety, and there was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of everything. I remember going to my mother's funeral just about 10 years ago now, and some of the people that I grew up with not really recognizing me because I was so different. Now, in my head, I'm exactly the same. I do know that I'm not the scared person that I used to be, because the fear stood out more than anything else. But there were so many more parts of me that I had worked on, so many more aspects is what we're saying of the ego that I had actually started to address. I'd started looking at my emotional responses, which for me was amazing. When someone explained to me, for years I used to hear, oh, you have no emotional regulation and we can't help you. And then when someone had the time to sit down and go, oh, this is what emotional regulation means, and this is how you could achieve it, which is where I got present moment awareness. I just looked at them like they were a genius from, you know, cloud whatever, because no one in all my years had explained that to me. It wasn't said out of judgment. It wasn't said that I was doing it wrong. They just wanted to give me an explanation of what it was. And I remember at that point going, that's what I want to do. I don't want anyone to think I have all the answers. I just want to be able to share my experience in the hope that it helps somebody else have an understanding. And having said that, when I look back, the personality, the emotions, the self that I am today is completely different to the self I was even 10 years ago, and night and day different from the self that I was in my 20s. And so so there's no point in the judgment, because if we're really honest, if we really look at what's going on when we're talking if something comes up with another person, the real question is, oh, do you remember that? Do you remember when that was happening for you? Because that's often what happens for me. I go, oh, I remember that. I remember how uncomfortable that felt, because no one explained it to me. So I think that's one of the things that I'd like our listeners, especially if they're early in the journey, to realize that there is no end spot to get to. No. We're not going to become Zen. We're not going to become, above everything that's happening on planet Earth because we are still here on planet Earth. But we start to become, and it's what I wanted most of my life, I wanted to be comfortable in my own skin. And I can say I'm probably the closest to that I've ever been in my life.
No, I agree with that. And I would say the same in my own experience, my own journey thus far. I'm at most peace I've ever been with my ego and all the components that come along with that. And I'm actually excited to continue to do the journey with my ego and to continue to explore the different elements of why my energy and my spirit, or whatever we want to call it, chose this experience for me to unfold with, and what people will continue to come in and out of my life, and the different experiences that I know will continue to appear. And parts of me will have amazing memories and experiences moving forward, and some of them not so great. And I think it's that because it's never not been that way for any of us is kind of the point. So to assume that it's not going to continue down that route, I think would actually be a misjudgment of reality.
I think it is a misjudgment of reality. And I think the other little barometer that we can use is anytime we're meant to get rid of anything that we're experiencing, we've gone off the side rail there. Like we might need to explore why we think we need to get rid of it and what's underneath that you think that's what you need to be doing. And that is where you start to get into that real self-reflection that allows you to go. But again, like I've said to you many times and say to many of my clients, my little mind is a lot like being in New York City in a dark alley by yourself. It's not someplace I tend to go alone because I don't always trust what comes out of it sometimes. And so I like to have a sounding board to reflect that. And sometimes when I'm doing that, I can hear, oh, that's a little bit far-fetched.
But again, that's how we grow to be able to understand these different parts of us and to get a different perspective, which is all a part of the growth. So it is important to have that sounding board. And again, exploring those different elements of our ego, but also that if we're also, as I mentioned earlier, pointing at someone else's ego, or if we're fighting our ego or we're fighting someone else's ego, you have to question, once again, what actually is lying deeper within that if you were to question what is that actually about. But once again, none of us have actually been taught or shown how to actually start to go that little bit deeper. And that's why sometimes as we get older, the ego actually gets stronger. Some of the patterns and behaviors even increase because it just gets more and more shoved into our face, let it be. With our parents, our siblings, our kids, our neighbors, our friends, is that these things tend to intensify because they're not being dealt with, and it's still part of our journey to explore them, whether we like it or not. Is it everyone's journey, as we talked about before, to have to explore it? No.
Yeah.
But I'm saying to think that, we have all of these things that make our ego, that as we talked about, thoughts, memories, experiences, and perceptions. And if you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, and you think that meditating for once a day is suddenly going to allow you to transcend all of that, but reading the books would make you assume that is the goal at times because of the way it's messaged.
Well, that is a lot of the way it's messaged. And I'll never forget the first time I had a teacher say to me, when people speak, they're really speaking about themselves.
Yep.
I can tell you this particular teacher must have said it to me every single time I saw her for 6 months before the penny dropped. And I looked at her one day and I went, wait a minute, hang on. And at the time I had been speaking about my ex-husband and it wasn't very pleasant. I was like, are you actually saying that because I'm saying that about him, I'm actually speaking about me? And I was like, hang on a minute. I am not blah, 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 blah. And she just sat there smiling. And I went, oh no. But it was beautiful because as much as I didn't want to accept it, and I walked out of that particular time with her and went home and mulled it over for about 2 weeks. I was like, oh, there could be some truth in this. I don't really want to admit the truth in that. And I think that was really the beginning of me being able to go, oh, wait, okay, so there's some stuff I need to look at inside of me instead of focusing on someone else.
I do think, like, most of the subjects that we talk about is maybe some interesting angles or some interesting stories that we cover along the way. But I think it actually, throughout my journey and with Michael and even prior to that, of actually allowing myself to explore ego from a lot of the different perspectives or angles has been such a freeing experience. Has it been something that has been quite challenging at times? Absolutely. But the fulfillment that has come from actually exploring it and no longer fighting myself. And as you and I have talked about so many times, Kim, is that doing this journey, it does take a village. And we're not built to do it on our own. Can you do large elements of it on your own? Absolutely. But it's that we often need a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different wisdom and knowledge, and to bounce things off of, to be able to understand of what external and internal is coming up for us to study. So all I can say from my experience is that I do love my ego because I'm now at peace with my ego. I'll forever continue to study my ego because, as we talked about, I still have a functioning mind, body, emotions. Experiences are still going to unfold, both positive and negative. And I look forward to actually being communicative and expressing and leaving everything behind that this ego has taught me on this journey. Let it be in a podcast, on books and material, even in conversations with people. So just to summarize, everyone has ego. And our journey here is actually to build awareness and to develop a relationship with our own individual egos, not necessarily with other people's. Other people's are just, as you mentioned earlier, a reflection of what we need to understand or study better within ourselves.
Right.
And the goal isn't to transcend, but to lean into it, to study it and explore why you have chosen this unique ego that you have.
Right. And I would say, I would finish off with that, to find a level of acceptance in some of the journey that we've had, and trust in the fact that we did get this ego because it is exactly what we need for this journey that we're on. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.